everyone. Welcome to the Tory Burch Foundation webinar on business strategy and seeing around corners. I'm Gabrielle Raymond McGee, the Chief Operating Officer of the Tory Burch Foundation. And today I'm here with Rita McGrath. And for those of you who don't know Rita, she is a faculty member at Columbia Business School. She's truly one of the leading experts on strategy and innovation. She's consistently ranked top management expert thinker. She's been listed in the top 10 minds for Thinkers 50 Global Management. So we're in great hands today. And Rita is the author of many, many books, but the one we're going to talk about today is how to see around corners, which couldn't be more fitting in these uncertain times, these challenging times of running a small business. So Rita, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're so grateful you're here to discuss key strategies for small business owners, how they can essentially know what's around the corner. And I know we've received so many questions for you, Rita. After your presentation, we're going to take time to answer questions from our audience. So I hope our community, I know we always get great questions in the Q&A chat below, and I'll be monitoring that. We'll try to get to as many as possible.
Great.
And we'll also be distributing Rita's slides via email later today. So be on the lookout for that in your inbox. And Rita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. It's a real pleasure to be here. And this is a community I feel very strongly and fondly about. So I'm going to keep my formal remarks fairly brief and make sure that we get to as many questions as you would like to address. So let me share my screen. Have a look at the new strategy playbook. And can you see that? Is that visible?
We can, Rita. Yep, it looks great.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. So the topic that I thought would be fun to talk about is really this notion of strategic inflection points. And with that, the corresponding need to prepare yourself to see around corners. And as we get started, I think the metric that we want to be honed in on is not necessarily prediction, because the future is just, I mean, who could have predicted last week what would even happen this week? So we're not really about prediction, but it's more, how do you build resilience? How do you create preparedness in the event that things might be quite different than what they had been in the past? So that's really the theme of this session. And so I'll talk about some techniques for doing that. Before I get there, let's put this in context, because I think this is very important for entrepreneurs to understand, which is, if you think about strategy, for many, many years in strategy, the idea was that you created this beautiful thing called a sustainable competitive advantage, and then you exploited that for as long as you possibly could. And what we found since those ideas were first made popular back in the 60s and even the 70s is the world has really changed. And so what we need to be thinking about as business leaders is always the complete life cycle of a competitive advantage. So call it the innovation or entrepreneurship process, where new advantages get going. The exploitation process, where you're getting resources back, you're making your money. And then, when the expiration date has passed, how do you now move on from something that had been successful at one point in the past? So this slide represents market share shifts in the gaming business. So in the beginning, all you had was arcade games. You had to go to a physical place and throw money at this thing, and because that was all there was, that dominated the market. But of course, that had a lot of negatives, right? So among them, the game and the machine on which it were played were the same thing. They were analog. So the next big wave of change was those games went digital. And so now you could have games on cassette tapes, and they had a lot of drawbacks too, but they were better than having to go to an arcade. So those became very popular. Then you started to see people experimenting with different form factors for games. So you started to see portable games and games that could be played on general purpose devices. And of course, today we have games that can be played, in virtual reality, in AR. In fact, just in my office here, I have my Christmas present from my brother was a pair of those Oculus, headset things. And it's really, really interesting and very cool. Even though I confess, I still feel kind of dorky wearing them, but it's a very interesting, different form factor. It really tricks your mind into thinking that things are different. So what matters here is the pattern. And my argument would be, as an entrepreneur, as a person leading a business, if this is what's going on outside your organization, you need to have enough variety inside your organization or with your community that you can respond. And the trendy word for this is pivot. So as the circumstances around your business change, how do you then change yourself? So an interesting example here in the pandemic was a company near Philadelphia that used to make beautiful custom grade shutters for homes. And in the early stages of the pandemic, nobody was buying shutters, but everybody needed PPE equipment. And so this entrepreneur kind of said, well, okay, I'm going to go into that business, manufacturing personal protective equipment, keep my people on board, make sure that I don't have a setback in keeping people employed and keeping the wheels turning in my business. It turned out to be another very successful line of business for him. So this is the context, right? This context of transient competitive advantage. And that, of course, was becoming more real even in the midst of the pandemic. So let's introduce on top of that the idea of a strategic inflection point. And what I mean by that draws on Andy Grove's observations back in the day, that what a strategic inflection point does is it exerts a 10x force on your business, something about your business. And that if you get it right, it can take your business to new heights. If you get it wrong, it can cause your business to go into decline. And so it's this pressure on your business that comes from a place you might not even have been looking. Now, why do so many people miss these strategic inflection points? And I think it has to do with the fact that over time, any business develops a recipe for success. So you get good at something and you're able to create that advantage, and it's able to last for a long, long time. And that very recipe for success can be a powerful blinder. Now, for those of you in the entrepreneurial space, the good news is that often the big incumbents get stuck right behind their vision of what their successful business is, and it leaves room for startups to come in. So let's take a specific example. Let's take the case of men's shaving. Probably a gentleman or two who shaves or doesn't, and the dominant player in this market for years and years was the Gillette company. And Gillette was purchased by Procter & Gamble in 2005 for $57 billion. So big commitment by P&G to get into men's grooming, men's shaving space. And their model was very simple. We invest in R&D. That allows us to create better products. That allows us to charge more for them. And then we use our armies of salespeople to get those products out into the retail channels. And the whole thing rests upon a layer of mass market advertising. So, ads on TV and radio and all that kinds of things. And this went on for decades, a brilliant, brilliant business model. So the part of the story that I find interesting starts in 1990 when Gillette's engineers, their scientists said, whoa, we can, using this incredibly difficult technology to master, we can put 2 blades on a stem. And that's going to give you a closer shave. And that became the sensor razor. And I remember teaching this case in business schools. It was such a successful launch that there's actually a Harvard Business School case written about it called Gillette, the launch of the sensor. And they had this fantastic cartoon that advertised the launch, which was the first blade would kind of come along, and pick the hair up from your face. And the second blade would come along and slash it open. And this was amazing. This was wonderful. And this carried them for about 10 years almost. And then toward the end of the 90s, the next big innovation, 3 blades. They called this thing the Mach 3, and it was again mass market advertising. Very cool. If you were cool enough to buy a Mach 3, you were cool enough to sit in the cockpit of a fighter jet. I mean, this was amazing. And they thought they were settled in for another 10 years of let's just exploit this thing. And then strategy disaster occurs. Schick, which had gotten acquired by a company that actually cared about the shaving business, came to market with the world's first 4-bladed razor. Oh my God, this was terrible. So what do you do if you're Gillette? Well, they unleashed all the lawyers, they tied everybody up in patent litigation, and then they rushed to market with the world's first 5-bladed razor. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is if you're a senior executive at the Gillette organization, you have all the money in the world, right? I mean, you've got all the money you need to do everything. You've got incredibly talented employees. You've got this army of researchers and scientists. You have incredible assets. Who would think that an entrepreneur could take that on? But meanwhile, kind of in 2011 around, there's a guy named Mike Dubin, who's kind of a failed entrepreneur. He applied to Columbia Business School, didn't get in. He's sort of knocking around trying to think what his next thing is going to be. And he runs into a gentleman at a party given by his dad, who has this interesting job where he buys things from one part of the world and sells them in another part of the world. And he'd happened to come across a shipment of razors. And so Mike and this other guy, who also was named Mike, get together and they start talking about what are the negatives of this experience that Gillette has so painstakingly honed over many, many years of practice, right? What are the negatives? Well, for one thing, the razors are expensive. I mean, that's by design. They're supposed to be expensive. Because they're little, they're also catnip for shoplifters. So you keep them in a razor fortress and you have to, beg someone to open it up for you. You have to go to the store. That's a hassle. You have to pay for the thing. And they just sort of said, why do we do it that way? Right? What about a vision for, and as Dubin recalls this, it sort of burst on him like an epiphany. He said, why don't we create razors on demand? It became Dollar Shave Club, right? It was one of the very first of this whole cohort of direct-to-consumer companies that would go and build a relationship directly with their users, leaving out the conventional retail markets. And literally 2 guys in a garage were able to tackle this fortress that Gillette had built. Now, how come they were able to do that? I would argue it's because digital transformation has radically created an inflection point in how we communicate and how we get our information. So these guys didn't need to build their own technical stack. They could use Amazon Web Services. They didn't need to engage in mass market advertising. They used YouTube. They made a hilarious YouTube video, which promptly went, very viral, very popular. They used Facebook to recruit brand ambassadors. Day one that they opened for business, they had 20,000 subscribers because people were fed up with this Gillette model. Now, not all people, not everyone, but enough of them that it made a real dent in Gillette's market share. And if you look at what's happened to them, and in shaving, Harry's has also piled in, and there've been other competitors coming in to basically say, Gillette, your fortress is not defensible. There's a better way to do this. We can get closer to customers by doing this. And of course, move this fast forward, and now you look at the pandemic. What's not selling at all during the pandemic is men's grooming. I guess all the guys are like at home with stubbly beards and sweatpants. And I think it's an interesting question to think about, which is, where are you really adding value? But here's an example of a startup company that was able to leverage these technologies to actually take on a major incumbent. So this brings me to an idea that I think is really important for entrepreneurs, especially, which is, in traditional strategy, we've always thought of the arena. We've always thought of the industry as being the thing that was going to determine your fate. So once you decided to enter into the widget industry, your position in that industry, how efficient you were relative to your competitors, how much differentiation you had, that was all going to determine how successful you were. Today, what I'm arguing is that's a really outdated notion, that, we make up what an industry is. So what industry is Dollar Shave Club in? Yeah, it's in men's shaving, but it's also kind of in tech. It's also kind of in male grooming, right? Unilever bought them in 2016 for $1 billion. I mean, that's how successful that brand was. So I think it's less useful as a way of thinking strategically when you're thinking about an opportunity. Instead, what I'm recommending is you think about a thing I call an arena, where an arena consists of some stakeholders. You can think of them as customers, but it could be other stakeholders as well, who go through their day with jobs to be done. There are things they want to accomplish. And this is a term that Clayton Christensen made very famous. He said, don't think about customers buying your product or service. Think about them hiring your product or service to get certain jobs done in their lives. And it can completely transform the way that you think about what it is you're really doing for your customers. So go back to shaving for a minute. I mean, who in the world gets up in the morning and says, yeah, great, I'm super excited today, I'm going to drag, cold steel across my face? Nobody, nobody, never in the history of the world, I don't think. What we want that look, right? We want to look just shaven, or maybe we want to look a little scruffy, or maybe we just want to look like we have a well-maintained beard, or whatever the look is. That's what we're after. So you need to be thinking about the arena that you're competing in, rather than just the strategy, the industry. So I'll move towards wrapping up with a couple of closing observations, and then we'll be able to get to some questions. The first observation is that in the world, what we're seeing is a real convergence between strategy, innovation, and increasingly digital. That you can't really talk about strategy today without talking about innovation. You can't really talk about innovation without some aspect of it being digital. And I think that's a reality that we're increasingly living in. So, some thoughts before I turn you back over to Gabrielle. I think the first idea is this notion of transient advantage, that you can't count on an advantage lasting, even if you built up a very strong one. So even somebody as powerful as Netflix, right? I mean, Netflix started out with DVDs in a box, then they went into streaming, now they're into original content creation. And, it's just been very big business model changes as they've gone through those changes. So even a very successful company's got to be prepared to transform in some way. Inflection points don't happen overnight. They feel as though they do sometimes, but what you really experience instead is, a gradual and then sudden outcome that can be very important for you. But usually, if you're paying attention, the weak signals are there. I do believe incumbents develop blind spots from their past successes, and that creates entrepreneurial opportunities for those that see ways customers could be served better or ideas could be more thoroughly explored or whatever. I think for leaders, for all of you, it has some new mandates. It puts learning right at the top of your agenda. Because in a highly uncertain situation, the only way you're going to get out of it is learning your way out of it, not planning your way out of it. So rapid learning, quick experimentation, and getting ahead of that change. As I mentioned, think about arenas, not particular industries. And when you start thinking that way, it really broadens the opportunities that can open up to you. And then finally, I think you really can systematically identify early warnings, those early kind of gee, why did that happen kind of moments, if you're paying attention. And as an entrepreneur, my recommendation is, keep track of those things. Keep a notebook or, on your phone or however you keep track of things you think might be important for your business. And be paying attention. Don't just keep heads down focused on today's business. Give a little thought to what's going on tomorrow. So if you'd like to keep in touch with me, here's how to do that. I'm available by email. I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm even on Instagram. I have a YouTube channel. I have a monthly newsletter that I send out, so you can sign up on my website. And lately, since the pandemic began, I've had the great pleasure to host regular Friday fireside chats, which are just conversations between people that I think are super interesting and super informative. And you can get access to all of those on my YouTube channel. There's no charge for them, and you're welcome to sort of be a fly on the wall at these conversations that I've had. Okay, so let me turn you back over to Gabrielle.
Rita, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I love hearing you talk about gradual and not being surprised suddenly. You have a quote. Can you reference that quote? I'm trying to remember about someone becoming bankrupt.
It was so it's from Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises. And the character called Mike Campbell in that book gets asked, well, how did you go bankrupt? And his response was, well, gradually, and then suddenly.
And how does that lesson apply to small business owners right now?
So I think, as with anything involving, a small business, right? Cash is king. And what you want to make sure of is that you've built enough robust revenue streams so that if you have a disruption, that you have some buffers built in. I mean, that would be the ideal situation. What I see in a lot of small businesses is this sort of wishful mindset, which is, oh, it's just going to be another 2 months and then things are going to turn around, or, oh, once we get this new location opened, we'll have all these new revenue streams or whatever. And I think sometimes people just aren't honest with themselves about how things really are going. So the first thing I would pay attention to is, if you really look at your cash flow and block it out for, several quarters ahead, how healthy are you really? So that's one I would really look at. Next, I have some warning signs that I think small business owners can be paying attention to. So, are formerly loyal customers suddenly changing their behavior in some way? Is there something that used to be good enough now all of a sudden it isn't? Or people reporting that, I used to make that part of my weekly routine. Maybe now it isn't. So be paying attention to customer behavior. And I think right now, where we are, it's January 2021. there's so much behavioral change inherent in having gone through the pandemic that I think it's really important not to just go on autopilot and assume your customers are going to behave the way that they always did. Certainly, we've all learned about, doing things more safely, shopping more remotely. We go to the grocery store and we're like commandos, right? It's like, I'm going to fill this cart up right now as fast as possible. Or maybe we don't even go to the grocery store anymore. Maybe we have someone else do it for us. So there's a lot of things that have changed. And I believe the watchword is it takes about 2 months to change a habit. We've all developed a lot of new habits. So I think the entrepreneurs in your community want to be really paying attention to that.
So in regards to new habits, what tips do you have on best way to learn about those habits from your customer or from the arena, if you will?
Sure. So the first thing I think is being open to asking questions. Depending on the type of business, it should be relatively easy to get into a conversation with customers, or even better, non-customers, and talk to them about what's changed for you. What are the things that you're really prioritizing now in terms of your budget? Because don't forget, anything you want people to spend on has to come from somewhere. So there's, how are they using their budgets? How are things with your family? What situations have transformed for you. So having conversations is the first thing I think is just super useful, but you have to be open to hearing what they tell you, right? So I hear a lot of entrepreneurs who kind of lead the witness, they like go to a customer like, oh, this thing I have here, like this beautiful pencil, wouldn't you like that? And nobody wants to be rude. So they all say, sure, yeah, of course. What they're not asking is, would you buy this pencil and not buy, dinner for a week? I mean, people aren't asking those questions. So just having conversations usually isn't enough. The second thing I really encourage people to do is really observe behavior, because customers will lie to you. It's not that they mean to. It's just we're all, as human beings, remarkably unaware of what actually drives our behavior. So, a great corporate example of this is years ago, McDonald's heard from all their constituencies, what we want is healthy, good for you stuff in McDonald's. And the theory they were operating on was the family rejection rate, right? So if you have a family of 5, we're deciding where to eat, and you got a picky teenager, picky girl teenager who doesn't want to eat McDonald's, that the whole family then moves on to the next place that has an offering for her. This is a whole theory, right? And that's how come they sold salads and stuff like that, which are not actually that much better for you than the other things McDonald's sells. But the other thing they invented was this thing called the McLean burger, which was a burger, but less fat, right? And as a marketing head at McDonald's said to me years later, they said, the only person that ever bought that stuff was in the marketing department at McDonald's. If you go to McDonald's, you know exactly what you are going there for. But when somebody says to you, are you the sort of person who would eat greasy, bad for you food full of French fries? And oh no, not me. No. I'm all about the kind bars, and I work out at the gym 6 times a week, and I'm not that person. So if you actually believe them, you can find yourself in investing in something that nobody's actually going to buy. Third thing, there's a wonderful book called The Right It. So The Right It, by a guy named Alberto Savoia, who is a serial entrepreneur, product designer for Google, really smart guy. And he has what he calls a skin in the game caliper. It's like a measuring tool. And he says, I give you points for each element of skin in the game, up to 100 points. So you ask somebody and they say they like their product, they like your product, 0 points. Somebody gives you an email, maybe you get a point for that, right? Somebody says, yes, I want to buy this, you get a few more points. Somebody says, how fast can I get it and who should I make the check out to? That's like 100 points. And his argument is that the way most of us do entrepreneurship is all wrong. He says, what we do is we build a product we think somebody wants, and then we try to sell it to them. Why don't you find out what somebody wants to buy and then go build that? Which I think is just a really different way of looking at it.
That's a great call out, Rita. We had an expert on user experience a while back, and she really encouraged our community to sell the product on their site, take payment, but don't make the product yet, right? So it's all about that lean startup and testing before you invest too much. And I know so many of the entrepreneurs in our community, especially right now, have very limited resources. Many of them are launching new businesses, doing it by themselves, or maybe with 1 or 2 other people. And we've received so many questions about focus and how to prioritize in the midst of these uncertain times. So can you talk to us a little bit about how to really be clear on what you need to execute, so you stay afloat and you thrive beyond 2021?
Sure. So I think there's a piece that has to do with taking some time to get on top of your own vision for yourself. And a framework I like to use is one that consists of three parts, right? So one part is, what is it that just intrigues you, that you think you could really be good at? One part is, where is there an economic demand? What do people pay you to do? And then one part is, what makes you the right solution to that, and where you want to be operating is the intersection of those three parts. So just as a person, as an individual, and this is something I teach, by the way, in our Women in Leadership course at Columbia. We spend a chunk of time really helping people crystallize and solidify their vision. Now, within that little box, right, now you have the question of what is your strategy? And I'm pretty disciplined about what a strategy is. So I define it as a central integrated concept of how we're going to achieve our objectives. And each of those words sort of matters. Central, everything I do in some way touches on that strategy. Integrated, it all works together. If I'm in a retail outlet selling Tory Burch stuff, I'm probably not selling really junky t-shirts, right? So it has to work together. Concept, it's got to be an idea, a compelling idea. And it's really about the how. So a good strategy sounds sort of like, I aim to grow to $250,000 revenue by serving previously underserved ethnic groups in my neighborhood through outreach to, new moms. Now, does that work? Is that feasible or not? But at least you're clear about what you're doing. And so, are you serving dads? No. Are you working in other ethnic groups? No. Are you in a very crowded area? No. So it helps teach you what not to do as well as what to do. And so I really suggest that you get very crisp about what that clear statement is, and make sure it tells you the how. That's what you're after.
There are so many shiny objects right now, for business owners. So getting clear is critical. And for many of our business owners, we're not just in winter seasonally in the Northern Hemisphere, but we're also in winter as far as how to trek through this pandemic. And I know you often talk about snow melting from the outside. Can you bring that principle in and describe it to us a bit more?
Sure. So I think one of the problems with small businesses, and I'm kind of a small business owner myself, is there's never enough time. Just promoting your business on social media, you could spend 24/7 doing nothing but that. So I think it's important to try to say, here are the frameworks I'm going to use to allocate my time. And here's the return on that time I think that I'm likely to get. So I think there's just a recognition that you can't do everything and you're going to burn out if you try to. Secondly, I think is, if you can you find some additional resources who can take things off your plate so that you can do what only you can do? So for example, could you use a virtual assistant who could maybe do some scheduling for you? Could do you have enough resource that you could actually use your precious resource to focus on bringing in more revenue, or bringing in more ideas, or bringing in more clients? Because what I find with a lot of small business owners is this real, penny wise, pound foolish mindset where, oh my God, I don't want to spend $400 a week on somebody to help me do something I can do for free. It's not for free, right? Your time has a value. And if you're constraining the growth of your business because you're doing stupid stuff somebody else could be doing, that's not a good way to spend your time. And I think one of the pluses of the pandemic is there's just incredible talent out there that's available for not that much money. And so think about those trade-offs, because what you want to be thinking about is the revenue line, not just the cost line, right? Could you grow your business 2x, 3x, 10x if you had some more help? And then finally, you get to this question of buffers and resilience. And what you want to look for is, again, at the edges, right? And the way I think about that is the things that are going to be important for your business going forward don't sort of pop into your news feed in the morning. They're out there, right? It's where a customer says, I really don't want that thing you're trying to sell me, but boy, if I had a solution to this problem, I would pay somebody to do that. You want to be alert to looking out for those things, but it means you need to take the time. And I know when you're already over your head, it feels like it's hard to do that. But even if it's an hour a week, just to go talk to somebody you wouldn't normally talk to, you know, visit people like that you haven't seen for a long time, and so forth. So I'll give you an example of a business idea that came across my desk this way. And I ask, especially women who happen to have kids, I said, like, okay, what would you spend, right? What would you be willing to spend at the beginning of every school year if you could know for sure every single date and program and plan that would cause your children to melt down into a pile of, hot fuss because mommy wasn't at the teddy bear picnic or whatever it is. And the highest number I've been quoted so far is $21,000. But it's because, we live in this world where the value of that information would be so significant, because otherwise, you can't plan your life otherwise. And so it's that kind of thing where people say, well, that problem doesn't really interest me, but this problem over here really might.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the idea of delegating and scaling your business. And it makes me think of Seth Godin was with our Tory Burch Fellows last year. And he challenged our fellows, our entrepreneurs, and said, do you want to be a freelancer or an entrepreneur? And for so many folks that don't delegate, they wind up essentially being a freelancer as opposed to really scaling their business. So I think that's a really important reminder. And I know you often talk about the value of people, and that human resources are one of our most precious assets for a small business, a company, et cetera. And we've received many questions about morale in the midst of this pandemic and how you can keep your employees motivated. So can you share any key management tactics that you've seen, especially that could be applicable to a small business that's trying to keep their workforce motivated, whether it be remotely or in person?
So one of the best references I can recommend to your audience is actually a great little book. It's a very thin book. It's called Helping People Win at Work. It's by Gary Ridge, together with Ken Blanchard. And what I like about it is and you can see I've even dog tagged it for myself. He has a bunch of templates in here about how you can structure your commitment with people. So this is Gary Ridge, who's the longtime CEO of a company called WD-40. And the subtitle of the book is called Don't Grade My Paper, Help Me Get an A. And his philosophy is that too often in business, we have this mindset of sort of, well, here's your objectives. And at the end of the year, if you don't meet your objectives, well, you did a bad job and you don't get a bonus, or it's sort of punitive, right? And what he says is, no, what you want to do at the beginning of the year is say, okay, here's what getting an A looks like. And my job, he calls it a tribe. My job as a tribal leader is to help you get an A. And performance reviews are not performance reviews. They're opportunities for coaching. And your job is to say if you're stuck or if you're struggling or whatever. So that's a great resource. It's totally scalable. WD-40 is a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise, but you could use it for yourself. You could use it for your family. So that's the first principle, which is if you and I both agree that what is a great outcome for both of us, if you get an A at the end of the year, then we're in it together, right? So I think that's the first practical thing I can offer. The second thing is, I think back to this mindset is don't think about people as costs, think about people as revenue generating opportunities. And if you think about them that way, the more of them you have, the more opportunity there is, which is kind of a, flip on the way a lot of business leaders think. And my go-to reference for that is a woman named Zeynep Ton. She's a professor at MIT. And she wrote a terrific book called The Good Jobs Strategy. And what she shows is that very often, especially in like retail environments or fast food or places where the wage scales tend to be on the lower side, she says these store managers think of their people as costs. And so you have things like very unpredictable work schedules, bad pay, blah, 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 blah. We're all familiar with that, what that looks like. And she says, look, if you flip it on its head and say, no, we're going to create a good job situation. We're going to back these people up with excellent operational capabilities, they can sell more. They can create a better customer experience. They can go out of their way to better serve your customers, and you can actually grow your business more because these people are helping your customers thrive. And a beautiful example of that is Costco. Those of us that live in the States know of Costco. It's a big warehouse store. They thrive on low prices, so they're not a high priced place, but they pay their people. I think the starting salary for a Costco worker is something like $22 or $24 an hour. They cross train them. So if you ask a Costco person in the light bulb section of the store, could you tell me something about where I can find skinny jeans? They don't just say, oh, well, they're over there somewhere. They will actually walk you to the end of the aisle. They'll say, Joe, got a customer for skinny jeans here. Have a great day, right? It's just a completely different mindset that they bring to work relative to, competitors who grind their people down. And the other thing I think that we often overlook is if you've got a good job and job security, and you feel that your employer really has your back, and you're shooting for that A, you're likely to be a better employee. If you are, in contrast, insecure, you feel the man is just hammering you, you feel like you're not being recognized for your accomplishments, there's no gratitude for what you've done, you're likely not to be a very good employee. And we kind of think of it the other way around. We're like, people get paid what they're worth. No, I actually think people, in many cases, they rise to what you have challenged them to do because you made it possible for that to happen.
And we're certainly seeing a shift in companies recognizing that employees and people in the workforce are their stakeholder, right? They're partners often. So I love seeing that shift. What are some of the smartest moves you've seen small businesses or medium-sized businesses make over the last year? And what are some of the mistakes you've seen that we can all learn from and avoid?
Well, I think the smartest moves have been to move fast, to recognize when things are changing. So as an example, I was working with a very small regional bank, and their customers are all people like the people in your community. They're local restaurants, local bars, auto dealerships, people out in the community. And what this bank did was they said, we got to help our community get a hold of this PPP money, this survival lifeline that the government was throwing it. And because they were small and nimble, they were able to move incredibly quickly to mobilize their people, find out what the needs were. They went so far as to, use other standards in their typical underwriting decisions for the quality of loans. They allowed their people to use their best judgment in terms of who should get this money, who would pay it back, blah, blah, blah. And they just cleaned the clocks of the large players who were just slow, who depended on things like credit scores. And just for that community, they really turned it around. So that was an example of something I thought was super smart in the midst of the pandemic. We saw a lot of, it kind of went through waves. In the early stages, people were just frozen in the headlights and nobody knew what was going to happen because, it was all going to be over by Easter, remember? And then it was all going to be over by the 4th of July. And then it was all going to be over by the time school started. And nobody thought we were going to be in for a multi-month, multi-year, potentially pandemic situation. And so I think what started to happen is the initial response was just batten down the hatches, try to conserve cash, crisis, crisis, crisis. And then people started to look at, well, where are the new needs popping up and where are the new ideas coming to the fore? And so you started to see, new businesses emerging to serve like bits of the market that had not been served so far. You saw people converting their businesses. So even big businesses like Whole Foods going into much more pickup, home delivery, let's try to do things safely. Best Buy, for example, totally converted their business to the point where you can just back your car up to a Best Buy and an employee will put it in the back of your car and you never have to talk to a human being. It's pretty amazing. So those are some really smart things I think people have done. The moves that I think have not been so smart are people that were just in denial. And a lot of large entities, especially that depended on people coming together in physical spaces. And I would say airlines, sporting teams, universities, they kind of went into denial that this thing could dramatically transform their business for the long term. And, I'll take universities just as a case in point. A lot of them were just not willing to say we can't have students safely on campus, and so have been big contributors to the subsequent spread of the disease, and that's been statistically studied pretty well. And so to me, that's just kind of denial. And if you know that you can't bring students back safely, then you shouldn't be doing that. And you've got to figure something else out, right?
Hearing these different examples, I'm reminded of Gladwell's David and Goliath book. I think that there will be a lot of stories of the Davids of the world, the small businesses that are able to pivot, to be quicker than big business and really innovate in the midst of challenge, right? Antonella is asking if you could provide some specific examples or of signals that show an inflection point for a company, some additional ones.
Sure. So I'll talk about one that I've been watching for a while now, two actually. One is the way that our social contract has kind of come to really favor shareholders and investors over just about everybody else in the economy. And there are a lot of signals to me that that is highly likely, especially with the new administration, to start to shift. And there are multiple signals to me that are this. So the first is there's a bunch of thought leaders who are really concerned about this. So people like Rebecca Henderson, Roger Martin, Peter Georgescu. You're seeing books now written about massive inequality and what that's done. You have a layer of people who've actually studied this. So people like William Lazonick at the University of Massachusetts, who studied how buybacks really interfere with corporate long-term growth. You've actually got the Business Roundtable saying, my God, there are people in the world other than shareholders. Then you've got businesses that are saying this is actually better for everybody if we run a more sustainable, more ethical business. So the outliers would be companies like Patagonia, of course, but you're even seeing companies like Best Buy and mainstream organizations, Costco, basically saying, we can't just run the place for extracting every last bit of value. We have to contribute to our communities and so forth. Then you've got a whole layer of policy stuff that's starting to happen. So Elizabeth Warren, again, would be a very well-known example, but talk about things like, should we put workers on boards? Should we see regulation around things like better jobs? Should we, have policies that make it much more difficult? Roger Martin, for example, has an argument that when it comes to shareholders, that one of the things that causes CEOs to make basically dysfunctional decisions is they're so afraid of activists. Well, think about it. If you made those who hold shares in a company and rewarded them for the length of time they hold those shares, it would completely get rid of this ability of a motivated investor to take 2 or 5% of a company and then just chase the company around the block because they happen to own a chunk of shares, but they haven't made a long-term commitment. They're not in it for the long ride. So those kinds of things would be very doable. So my point is that I can't predict what's going to happen, probably not as much as the progressive wing would like, and probably a lot more than perhaps the more conservatives would like. But what I can tell you is there are all these signals that concerned people who have a voice in the public realm are starting to say, this has gone too far. We need to make a radical change. And, there's another very interesting scholar, a guy named Peter Turchin, who says, this is exactly what you can expect if you have a vastly unequal allocation of resources in a society. It'll be more violent. That's what you're going to get. So you can see a lot of those weak signals leading to some kind of social contract change. So for those of you that are interested in this, I've got a whole article laying it out in my blog in which I talk about a way of framing the future, which is you take two uncertainties that are, important to you or your business, and then you posit future values of each uncertainty that's different. And that gives you 4 or more conceivable futures you could be looking at. So another example would be, are we going to have a baby bust or not? There's a lot of signals that say people are, with economic insecurity, they're not growing their families as much as they like. They're not starting families. Now, what are the indicators that lead up to that possible scenario? Well, let's take weddings. I mean, it's fairly conventional for people to have the wedding first before the baby, but weddings have now kind of been put on hold in many cases. Fertility clinics have been not as readily available as they once were, and. Now, I'm not predicting there will be a baby bust because there are these countervailing factors, right? People are saying, maybe I want to be at home. Maybe I want to surround myself with other people. Maybe I want to be more domestic now, So I'm not predicting one or the other. What I'm saying is those are signals you could pick up. And the great thing about demographics is, if you want to know how many 10-year-olds there are going to be in 2031, guess what? They're all going to be born this year. It's absolutely factual. So you can find that.
I have a feeling there will be many new dating apps after this pandemic or during the pandemic for new creative ways to connect, because we all are relational beings. We're getting a number of questions for new entrepreneurs. We have so many folks that have just started a business in the last year, and they're asking you specifically what they need to be thinking about as they launch new businesses in this current climate, how they can really continue to survive and thrive. So if you have any tactics and specific advice for very new business owners.
Sure. Well, the first, rookie mistake that people make is putting money, time, and attention into anything that isn't creating a customer for your business. So you're not an entrepreneur because you have an office. That's kind of less relevant than it used to be. You're not an entrepreneur because you have a business card. You're not an entrepreneur because you have a cool website. You're an entrepreneur because somebody who you offer something to says, I really would pay you for that thing, whatever that is, whether it's a product or a service or whatever. So I think the first rookie mistake is you think all the trappings of running a business are the business. It's not. If you don't have customers, that's it. And Peter Drucker said this very famously years ago. He said, the purpose of a business is to create a customer. And if you don't do that, then you really don't have something. So I think that's job one. Having found a customer or steady stream of customers with a particular need or job that you can help them get done, then I think the next thing is back to this question of, well, how are you going to keep that flow of income coming and steady, and so it's looking, who are you serving today, what's that next pipeline like, what are the leads that get you to the next set of people that you could influence. So I think what sometimes happens with people that are just starting a business, they get so excited to have one customer, right? Like, let's say it's a consulting business. You get so excited to have one customer, you put all your time into that customer. And then when that contract's done, you're sitting there with no pipeline. So you need to be thinking about the health of your pipeline and how you're going to grow that. And then I think the third thing I would think about is, how are you going to get the word out about what you're doing? And again, this is another rookie mistake entrepreneurs make. They buy this idea that, oh, I build a better mousetrap, people will beat a path to my door. Guess what? No. So whether it's social, whether it's connections, whether it's asking for endorsements, whatever it is, you need to be prepared to promote what you're doing as much as doing it. And this is where I think a lot of people get very, I'll call it diffident, right? Because it seems self-promotional. It seems sort of cheesy, to say how great you are. But you really have to do that because people's attention spans are limited. The amount of time they're going to give to thinking about what you're doing is very small. So you need to figure out some way of getting yourself to be more relevant.
Those are great action steps, Rita, for our community. And I know another action step will certainly be for everyone in this community to read Seeing Around Corners and ordering online if they haven't already. I know when I think about all of the negative news and just all of the conflict in our world right now, when I think about the positive energy of this community, I often say it's like taking a very big dose of positive vitamins in reading the comments and the encouraging posts from our community. What makes you optimistic around small business owners right now? Small business owners are obviously the backbone of our country. That has been proven many times over through this pandemic. So what gives you hope and optimism?
Well, I think that it's easier than it's ever been to start a business. So, it genuinely is true. If you have a good idea and some luck and maybe a little bit of resource, you can actually get something going much more easily than it would have been if you needed to go buy computer systems and hire programmers and stuff like that. So I think the barrier to starting is lower than it once was. I do think it's an alternative way of having a career. And for women especially, this corporate notion that, I joke about this, right? That corporations are built around the male life cycle. So in your 20s, you're figuring out what you want to do. In your 30s, you're high potential or you're also ran. Your 40s, you're taking the reins of power. You're 50, you kind of get one blonde and a Ferrari. And then your 60s, you're sort of handing over to the next generation. It doesn't work for women, not at all. And so what I'm seeing women doing is designing careers for themselves that are actually very different, which may involve, so maybe I'll do my own thing for a while, then maybe I'll go back into a corporate role when I feel that's ready for me. So there's a lot more flexibility that I think we're seeing. So that's another source of optimism. And then I believe people want the best for themselves and their communities and the people that they're with. And I'm hoping that we can have a less divisive approach to one another, once the incentives for being divisive are reduced.
Well, thank you, Rita. Is there one action step that you would like all of us to take to see more clearly around corners that we can apply to our business before we go?
Sure, I'd ask yourself this question, and this is a good question to ask those around you, right? So I'm not going to change your whole personality overnight, but if I could change how I spent 1 hour a week, what should I do 1 hour more of, and what should I do 1 hour less of? And if you would give me that feedback and get that feedback from the people around you, I promise it'll open your eyes to some things you probably weren't thinking about.
Well, thank you, Rita. We've all learned so much from you, and we're so grateful for your valuable insights. What I know, you had your slide of how we can stay in touch. Can you put that up one more time so we can sort of follow you? And you mentioned the Columbia Women's Program. Can you talk a little bit about that for those that might be interested?
Sure. So I run a program called Women in Leadership, which it's 2 short days a week spread over 4 weeks. And it covers storytelling, getting and giving feedback, developing your own personal vision, how you work with your network, really valuable things for women business owners to learn from. So that's running, it starts up next February 2nd. So we're starting up pretty soon. So that's a really great resource if you can manage that. I also at Columbia run a course on growth, corporate growth, which is meant more for corporate entrepreneurs, but I get the odd, self entrepreneur. That runs in April. That's called Strategy Under Times of Uncertainty. And then, I do a lot of this sort of thing, do webinars and things, and you can find out about those on my website, the things. And then Friday Fireside Chats, free, they're live. If I don't get to the questions in real time, I follow up with the people that put questions in the chat. So that's another opportunity to be sort of part of the world.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rita. Well, we will certainly be following along with your work. And thanks everyone for tuning in. As I mentioned earlier,